Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of How to Leave a Cult. I am Brooke Walker, and How to Leave a Cult is a story about my biographical life living in a cult for a very long time, since I was about 8 years old. And also trying to give you tips and tools if you have trauma from some level of religious abuse, as well as try to break down some understanding of how cults and churches can operate in a way that can be manipulative on all different levels. I think that one of the really interesting things is that what cults do is still very common in everyday churches. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be part of a community that's meaningful to you. What I want to say with that is understand that people are fallible. And just because they're in a church environment doesn't mean that they are not. So, buyer beware on what you're going into or looking for. Last episode, we talked about Waco and the ripple effects that were caused simply by everything that occurred during that time. And that was back in 1993. But it caused ripple effects because we were a cult, just to state it simply. And there was already a lot of rumors going on, and there was already a lot of agitation within the neighboring community. And now, by this time, most of the church had moved from Mesa to Payson, and outside of Payson specifically to Tano Village. So many of the houses were bought up in that area, and there was a lot of interactions with other people who lived around there, and I would say a lot of them were not great. After Waco, more threatening began, and there was more rumors spread. So today I thought it would be interesting to just dive into the media and the lawsuits that occurred. Now, these run from, the first lawsuit due to all of this was in 1993. Now, there was a previous lawsuit with a member back in, I believe, like 87, 86. I'm not sure exactly when. I have done a lot of research, but I wasn't able to find it. And when I say I did a lot of research, mostly it was just internet searches. I know how to go to the courthouse and do other stuff. I'm not going to. This is my story. I'm going to share with you what's easy to find. This is more about my story than it is simply the research, but I think the research is interesting, and I think it's very telling. And there was a lot of stuff in the news. And so today I'm going to go over some court documents to kind of break some of the stuff that was going on down so that you have an understanding. And I'm going to go through the media that occurred. Now, after the bodyguards were hired, they also reached out to a news station because they thought reaching out to a news station would offer more security and safety. That had an opposite effect. So what happened is the news station, looking back, and this was not my feeling at the time, looking back, I would say the news station saw the community for what it was, and they spoke to a lot of previous members who were also on this recording, and they aired a few-minute recording of people who had previously been in the church. It included Trina and Steven. Trina tranced in it. It included a cult expert, Rick Ross, who stated that we were a dangerous cult based on a lot of information he was given to review. We're going to kind of dive a little bit into that today. We're going to talk about how it circulated throughout the news. And I kind of want to touch on too, I want you guys to understand in the midst of this, and this is several years even, in the midst of this is from me being age 15 till probably, I think, until I was about 17, that I was working for my dad. All these lawsuits were cycling through. There was depositions going on with all of these people. To us, the people who were doing this were persecuting us. All the other girls that were my age were still in school. So there was a lot of bullying and harassment in school for everybody who was of an age to be in school. So it was very volatile and dangerous. At the same time, they're in the middle of trying to get a charter to have the schooling covered financially, which has been a publicly run school, which we're going to get into that too, because there was a whole lawsuit in regards to that, and there's media about that. So it's going to be an interesting one today. I don't know. This one may go longer today. We'll see how it goes. We'll do our best to get in and out, but we're just going to dive straight in. So, all right. And these are going to be mostly in order. Well, the news articles are going to be in order, and then I'll go through some of the pleadings that also I have. And because I want you to understand a lot of the things that happened and how they broke down, and it speaks for itself. And it's funny too. I didn't read any of these until now, and it's just everything I've said up until this point from my perspective. So, first one, and most of these are the Arizona Republic, and I'll tell you if I reach ones that are not the Arizona Republic. And I may not read every article from the beginning to end, because some of them are not completely in regards to the Church of Immortal Consciousness. The first one is from June 18th, 1995, Arizona Republic, front page news. And, you know, the front page being just a small article right here, and it's about new schools being scrutinized. So the new schools being scrutinized is that there was many schools that were working to get charters, and the Shelby School was one of them. The Shelby School was kind of the shining star of the ones at the time, but a lot of them got denied because people that they had on the boards had really poor credit histories. And I think specifically, if I remember correctly, my dad was one of the people that was on the Shelby School board that they ended up removing and maybe reapplying. I'm not sure exactly what they did to get the charter. I mean, I remember all the drama around it, but, you know, not the details. But I do remember he was on there, and the reason my dad had such a fucking shit financial situation and credit history is because he had taxes that they weren't paying. My dad had years of back taxes because he's working full time and all of his money goes straight into the church, and then it's chosen how that gets paid out. So there was years my dad was making great money, and he had help from my grandparents at times. Like, they leveraged the shit out of my grandparents, and I don't know, nor do I necessarily think I want to know how much money came from my grandparents that went to the church, but it was more than it should have been. And it still upsets me because I grew up fairly poor, but my dad made great money. And it really messed up me on a financial basis on the way that I saw money at the time. So they're going for the charter schools. New schools scrutinized. Over the past year, Jim Alverson's become somewhat of a pioneer in Arizona's charter school movement. And so this is, starts out with a teacher and how they were going through the Board of Education, and it was one of the first applicants. So this was when they really began to first get started. And so he was one of the... He quit his job, started signing up students, helped to form Arizona Charter School Association, and was named its first president. Dream came to a screeching halt day before to sign the lease on a school facility, the state board citing his bad credit history, and they yanked his charter. And in recent months, he isn't alone. Okay, so just roughly. And it's a very long article. Goes into a lot of that particular situation. And Arizona is one of 11 states that allow charter schools, which are designed to provide alternative to regular public schools. They're exempt from many of the state statutes and regulations imposed on regular schools, such as teacher certification, compliance reviews, and mandated classes. However, because charter schools receive public funding, they must comply with all federal, state, and local laws pertaining to health and safety, civil rights, insurance, special education. They're also required to maintain high levels of student achievement and to practice sound fiscal policies or risk losing their charters. Although this is the first year that charter schools have been allowed in Arizona, 43 are expected to open this fall. That will give Arizona second most charter schools in the country behind California, where there are nearly 100 have opened in the past few years. So, and just to have an understanding, the basis of a charter school is there is a certain amount of money allotted that is, based on the taxes you and I pay for each child that's in the school system. So when a charter school gets a charter, the money that would go to a public school now goes to that charter school. And they had applied for it, and then specifically what happened in their, and again, this is how churches threaten the masses, or how cults do, whatever way you want to put that. A handful of letters from Payson people Another school, the Shelby School near Payson, was rejected because of unfavorable credit reports and tax liens involving some of the officials. Pretty sure it was my dad. However, Stephen Wrench, a lawyer and school official, contends that substantiated claims that the school is run by a religious cult is the real reason for the rejection. Lawsuit threatened. Big bold letters. A handful of letters from Payson people caused the background check to be expanded into a major investigation, said Wrench, who's threatening to sue the State Board of Schools appeal is rejected. They found no criminal wrongdoing, yet we were revoked. The Shelby School in Tonto Village, 16 miles east of Payson, is run by the Church of Immortal Consciousness. Lisa Graham, state superintendent of public instruction and a member of both state boards that review charter schools, said she never was concerned about the school's church connection. If the Church of Immortal Consciousness wants to run an academic program without any religious instruction or affiliation, it's perfectly legal for them to do that. Graham said, I have a bigger concern about their financial problems. Officials of several rejected schools said financial problems could easily be reflected by simply replacing the school officials with others who have squeaky clean credit records. However, state officials said any change in the makeup of charter school board would require the school to refile its application and start the entire process from scratch. I realized that these rejections came late in the process and the timing was bad for schools, but it had to be done. We have legitimate concern over demonstrated ability of the applicants to manage funds. I think it's reasonable to request that they have fairly clean financial record. We're not talking here about 30 days late on a Dillard's payment. So, Article 1. Now, that's 1995. I know that a lot of the stuff I talked about in 1993, Waco and all of that kind of stuff, that all snowballed into the lawsuits, and this is when the lawsuits actually began to get into the newspaper. But the Connie Miller lawsuit started around that time, and that was a lawsuit against Connie Miller, her husband, the sheriff's department, and it was about defamation and rumors that were being spread around Payson, as well as the inaction of the sheriff's department to offer protection when there was a lot of threats and stuff that were going on at the time. And here is where that one went. Arizona Republic, front page newspaper. Spirit bears witness in suit. And when I say front page, this is a picture. You really can't see it on this very well, but this is a picture of Trina actually trancing. And you can't see it much better there. It's creepy looking from there. It's a creepy view. Channeling session makes some doubt jurisprudence. Courtroom drama has never reached such heavenly heights. In a Payson courtroom, a judge allowed a medium to channel the spirit of a centuries dead man. The spirit then gave testimony and a pretrial hearing on a slander suit that has been popping around the court system for 2 years. Like I said, it started in 93, right around when the bodyguards were hired, right around when Waco happened. After the spirit's testimony, the lawsuit was dropped and legal history was made. The spirit said, channeler Trina Camp is Dr. Paulvan Duran, a 15th century Englishman who provides inspiration for an organization called the Church of Immortal Consciousness. Camp is the leader of a group which is based in Tano Village, east of Payson. Spectators at the hearing gave this accounting. Lights were lowered in the courtroom, church followers broke into a Beatles tune, In My Life, and Camp's head lowered to her chest. On the second verse, she raised her head and said, I'm Dr. Duran. I wish to get this show on the road. For a guy who has been dead 500 years, Duran is hip. Since moving to Tano Village from Mesa about 8 years ago, camp followers have inspired controversy. They've been labeled a cult, devil worshippers, baby sellers. The talk resulted in the slander suit the church brought against a Payson couple who they charged started most of the rumors. Surrounded by a mom of relatives in her Tonto Village home, Camp answered some of the gossip before bringing Duran forth in an interview Tuesday. She also outlined some of her religious tenets. There is no death and there are no dead. We live beyond our bodies. Christ does not create us to kill us. There is no hell. Christ's teachings are basic evils of our own mind. As for the accusations, Camp explained them this way. The group is not trying to intimidate non-members into moving away from Tano Village, leaving it for the exclusive use of her church. No brainwashing, sorry, she laughed, adding that nobody is forced to give Camp all his or her money, although the group is collective and money is shared. There's no illicit sex because Duran teaches monogamous relationships as a way of life. Camp didn't get angry until talk turned to the story about church women having babies and then selling them for adoption. That is a filthy rumor, she raged. Other rumors about the group say members sell their sons, sacrifice animals, and have women dancing nude around a campfire. As a result of these rumors, Camp said their children have been threatened. It was at this point Stephen Camp said that the church fought back through the courts. Now, I'm going to pause for a second. There are a lot of cults and there are a lot of churches that manipulate systems for their own use. And, I think one of the bigger examples is how threatening and intimidation. And the Church of Immortal Consciousness, because they had several attorneys in pocket, they could create these massive lawsuits that they never had to actually pay for. My dad was just their bitch. And same with the others too, and did as he was told. So even though he'd put 60 extra hours a week into doing these cases, and never got a fucking dime from it. And so they use this, and they use their members, and they manipulate their members, and they use them as bulldogs to attack other people. And it's really horrible. And there's a lot of churches that do it. And interestingly enough, I was threatened with a lawsuit. shockingly, I was threatened with a lawsuit a few years back because I did an interview with a woman, and she wanted to do the interview because she had been in a cult, and it was a church locally here in Phoenix metro area. I don't remember exactly where it was. Post on the internet, never thought a person would watch it. Never thought more than a couple people would watch this interview. Somebody got a hold of it and started passing it around, and it went kind of viral. There was thousands and thousands of views. And this was right before the pandemic. And because it got so many views, and because of the pandemic, it got more views. So then everybody is going to church through YouTube, and the first video that comes up on their church is my video with her. So I get called from her daughter, unfortunately, and take it down. My mother's crazy. And we had a very long conversation. And by the end of it, she basically threatened to sue, that the church would come after me and sue me if I did not take it down, that it was defamation. And I thought that that was fascinating to be on the other side of it. If I just like unemotionally look at that perspective, and I told her if that's what she felt like she needed to do, she was more than welcome to. I told her she would have to sue her mother as well if that's the route she went, because I never made any accusations. Her mother did. And it ended there. Never anything ever happening from it. But Church of Scientology is really big on this. They're very threatening to members that have previously been a part of their church. So it's a tactic. It was at that point Stephen Camp said that the church fought back through the courts. What do you do as a man when your family's threatened, he asked. We did nothing until their attacks turned against our children. Trina Camp said Duran first appeared to her when she was 9 years old, now 47. Camp said she, Duran, and her husband formed the church 12 years ago. Duran is the teacher and spiritual advisor. Mediums run in families. It's in your blood, she said. Some have it, some don't. It's a commitment with Duran and me. Camp then settled in a large chair, legs crisscrossed under her, and closed her eyes. Her surrounding family and friends started singing a hymn. Camp's head came up from her chest, and in a low, gravelly voice announced that Dr. Duran was ready to get started. The accent sounded more like a Scottish burr than an English lilt. Other teachings of Duran, the voice said, are against promiscuity because that brings about disease on the planet. He believes in commandments of Moses, of people loving others despite and beyond their sins. It is a simple teaching, Duran continued, of love and giving, of parents looking after their children as reflections of themselves, of loving someone more than yourself. The courtroom appearance in Payson 2 weeks ago was, the voice said, the first time that he had ever testified. I thought I did a wonderful job, the voice added. He had to cut it short, however, because he told the court he had an appointment in Russia. His advice is to both sides. I said, stop, I want this settled today. It was both sides agreed to drop the suit with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled. The unorthodox remedy has irked some people in Payson, where critics are saying that juris lost its prudence. Judge Michael Flournoy of Coconino County Superior Court, calling from a houseboat on Lake Powell, said he never would have allowed the testimony in a regular trial. However, he believed the plaintiffs just wanted to present what their beliefs and convictions were all about. Dr. Duran did that. I believe it's a judge's job to help. Help people settle their differences, he said. It was interesting. Flournoy took over the case in August of '94 when the church petitioned for the removal of the original Gila County judge, Robert Duber of Globe. Duber refused to allow Duran's testimony. Bill Norman of the Arizona Supreme Court's Administrative Office said an extensive search of a comprehensive national database showed no record of any testimony occurring anywhere else. Robert Myers, presiding judge of the Maricopa County Superior Court, didn't think such an appearance would be allowed in Maricopa County, but he would never say never to anything. Every judge is his own boss on his bench, Myers said. Norman said the database won't list the testimony as divine intervention, the Twilight Zone, or anything else colorful. Instead, it will be entered as a mundane alternative dispute resolution. So, that lawsuit dragged on for quite some time. And in the meanwhile, it was just complete drama. So that article was July 27th of 1995. So that was really a month after the school article. Which brings us to November of 95. Yay. School sues state agency claims bias. And this is from November 4th, 1995. And this is under Valley and State. And it is front page of Valley and State. So it's not front page of the main paper. The other two were. A Payson private school has sued the State Board of Education, charging that the agency rejected its charter school application because of the religious affiliation of its founders. Several Shelby School officials, including its education director, are members of the Church of Immortal Consciousness, which has been referred to as a cult by residents. Stephen Wrench, attorney for the school and a church member, said the school is not affiliated with the church and uses a secular curriculum. Wrench filed the lawsuit last month in Maricopa County Superior Court. The church and the school, which has been operating for 12 years in Mesa until moving a few years ago to Tonto Village, 16 miles east of Payson. Area residents since have complained to the Gila County Sheriff's Office that the church has conducted cult-like activities and that its members have practiced food stamp fraud, adoption misconduct, child selling, and intimidation. The allegations never have been substantiated. Last May, after receiving preliminary approval by the board, Shelby's charter application was rejected because background checks on school officials unearthed bad credit history. Shelby unsuccessfully appealed the rejection in August. Wrench said the rejection came only after board members learned of the allegations against the church. Terry Skadney, I'm not sure if the last name's right, an assistant state attorney general who represents the Board of Education, denied the allegation last week. She said that the board rejected the charter application because of unfavorable credit records at the top of the school officials, not because of their religious activities. The school lawsuit seeks to require the board to pay the school all the state charter school funding it would have received since July 1st. The school was expecting to receive about $180,000 a year in state funding. So, that lawsuit was filed. Let's get into some of the others. And then Church of Immortal Consciousness against, so you've got the Miller and the sheriff lawsuit. Then you have the state board lawsuit in regards to the charter. And then there was a lawsuit against Scripps Howard Broadcasting, who was the news station at the time, Rick Ross and Tony Kovaleski. And Tony Kovaleski was he was the one who actually, he was the reporter. Sorry, spitting it out. So I wanted to read this because I think it's fascinating. And this is the undisputed facts concerning the alleged acts of defamation. And this was based on what Rick Ross said. So Rick Ross is a cult expert. And one of the things that Rick Ross has gotten, he's done a lot of stuff to raise awareness about cults, but he's also done some other stuff that's been controversial. And, you know, I think it's an area people haven't known how to do it. So I'd say his controversialness is because there was no known way of how to get people out of cults. And I'm not excusing him. I don't really have an opinion. My opinions about him are odd because I was raised in a cult. So I'm trying not to be triggered by him as a person. All right. Number 1, Rick Ross is a nationally recognized consultant on cults and potentially unsafe or controversial groups. The Church of Immortal Consciousness is a religious organization incorporated as a nonprofit in 1983. Most of members live collectively in Tonto Village. The Church of Immortal Consciousness spiritual teacher is Dr. Duran, who's claimed to have practiced a kind of medicine in England during the 14th century, and whose spirit purportedly speaks through the mediumship of Trina Camp. Stephen and Trina Camp are founders, and two of the 5 ministers. In August of 1995, a producer from Channel 15 contacted Ross and informed him that the station was investigating the church, asked him if he was willing to review documentation on the station's possession, and performing this review, discussed the church with its producer. Ross agreed to review materials and discuss the church according. Ross reviewed the documents concerning the church and its members listed. And I'm going to go through some of the things that were said, because I think this speaks a lot about, because this has information about people who left prior. So a lot of these were found by the investigation that was done by Scripps Howard, the news station. Ross concluded after reviewing everything that they were an quote, destructive cult group. Ross based his conclusion on the general accepted definition of the term as a group greatly devoted to one individual or an idea, and his observation in light of the materials reviewed that the church greatly devoted to Trina Camp and the idea that she's capable of channeling Dr. Duran into the present. Ross based his conclusion that the church was a destructive cult on evidence in the materials that it has a pyramidal structure of leadership with the camps at the top. The leaders have little real financial or decision-making accountability to the rest of the church members. It fosters an us versus them mentality as seen by the problems with other people in Tonto Village, the hiring of armed guards. It is engaged in financial and emotional and psychological exploitation. It has broken apart at least one natural family. It isolates its members from the outside world. It has exercised undue influence on its members of the group. Ross then informed Channel 15 producer of these opinions, and the producer asked Ross, and Ross agreed to recount the opinions in the interview, because he was filmed I've looked for it, I can't find it. The actual news station clip, because it's a few minutes long. Ross interviews made part of the segment an edition of Channel 15's news segment, The Investigators, narrated by Tony Kowaleski. Kowaleski introduced Ross as a consultant on cults, deprogrammed former cult members. Ross made only the following statements on camera. I've seen this before. This is nothing unique. I think that when a group is gathered around an individual with the type of authority and power that we're seeing here, evidenced in these tapes, we're talking about a cult group, and we're talking about a destructive cult group. After the broadcast, Steve Wrench, a minister and attorney of the church, telephoned Ross. In the course of this conversation, Wrench admitted that the church had openly hostile relations with non-member residents in Tonto Village that frequently culminated in violence. employed armed guards in Tonto Village, and had financial difficulties in its relations with at least one member, having not convinced Ross to visit the church in Tonto Village because of the presence of armed guards. Wrench concluded the conversation by observing, "Rick, what goes around comes around." A representative of Arizona State University contacted Rick Ross in August 95 and asked him to give a lecture on cult groups. The lecture Ross delivered in November 14th of 95 concerned cult groups in general, with some emphasis on Arizona-based cult groups. It consisted of a lecture session that lasted approximately an hour and a question and answer section that lasted approximately 20 minutes. During the lecture, Ross described the characteristics found in most, but not all, cults. He did not imply or assert that the Church of Immortal Consciousness possessed all of these general characteristics. Ross mentioned Church of Immortal Consciousness only briefly, included it on a list of Arizona-based cults. In those brief comments, Ross made the following statement about the Church of Immortal Consciousness. The Church of Immortal Consciousness had harassed Ross. Church of Immortal Consciousness members had bought up quite a few lots in Tonto Village and hired armed guards, although the other residents of Tonto Village were, by guesstimate, basically retirees and not very threatening. And a former member claimed to have lost $70,000 to the Church of Immortal Consciousness. During the question and answer format, Stephen Camp stood up and demanded to know why Ross had called the church a destructive cult. Ross tried to explain the basis of his opinion, but Camp became angry and further pursued the issue. The confrontation continued until John Crawford, an ASU professor, interrupted Camp with a question of his own. Camp left the meeting and the church was not discussed again. And there's an article that I'm going to reference after I'm finished with this that's on that too. And just to reference a little bit about what it says. Ross stated that the evidence on the church was very solid and it indicates it's a destructive cult. He stated that he is thorough when he investigates a group and decides to call it a cult. He also explained the information that he relied upon to conclude the church is a cult. Finally, Ross stated that the church was starting to look like a church of Scientology because of its litigiousness. It's funny, I didn't even know that was in there. And I was just referencing how similar we were. From its inception until the late 1980s, the Church of Immortal Consciousness, and I may just say church, was located primarily in Mesa, Arizona, where group members lived collectively in a number of houses near the house of Trina and Stephen Camp. Each of these houses handled their finances on a collective basis. Finances for the collective as a whole were not centralized. Stephen Camp described the philosophy underlying the church's practice of collective living as a personal spiritual philosophy of his that was also learned from the spirit, Dr. Duran. Stephen Camp marketed Trina Camp as a medium for Dr. Duran through his company, Trance International, by sending a packet of newspaper articles featuring Trina to people who might be interested in setting up trance circles. Trance International also publicized relationship seminars offered by Stephen and Trina Camp. Stephen Camp testified that people who were introduced to the camps at such venues would then sometimes join the church. When new members joined the collective, during the Mesa years, they were assigned to a house by Duran. Similarly, Dr. Duran or Trina Camp would determine where to move a collective member if problems emerged with an initial placement. Stephen Camp admitted that he and his wife were likely to have been the decision makers on major church matters, naming the church, the school, Stephen Camp acting as the president of the Shelby School, dismissing the Miller lawsuit, deciding to sue investigative report services. Financial decisions in the collective houses in Mesa were made by heads of household who were appointed by the camps because they had shown they could handle the money righteously in the priorities of the camp's spiritual philosophy. And this comes from a former member. Former member Mark Butterfield, the head of his household in Mesa, ultimately was accountable to Stephen and Trina for the way he handled the house's finances. Stephen and Trina Camp decided when funds had to be transferred from one household to another and could request contributions from all houses for large purchases, like a truck for Trina Camp. That's an actual example. So there was times where it's like there was deemed something needed to be purchased, and then it was put on everybody to fund the money for it. Stephen and Trina also designated individuals who in their absence could give expression to their spiritual philosophy. So other ministers or just people that they would allow to do things. Paulette Butterfield was described number 2 in the church next to Trina. Walker also described the Butterfields' home in Mesa as one of Duran's temples and described Paulette as a feminine voice of the teaching in the temple. Former church member Sarah Light perceived the church was organized hierarchically, with people like Paulette occupying an intermediate position between themselves and Trina and Stephen, who were at the top of the pyramid. Church collective finances became centralized in the hands of Stephen Camp, and at that time, the church moved to Tonto Village. Camp has since ceded control of finances to his son-in-law, Stephen Wrench, who in turn also has passed it to Camp's adopted son, William Camp. Stephen Camp has discretion over what portion of the members' contributions to the collective would be used as tithes to the church. Stephen Camp has similar discretion regarding the use of funds given to the church members by their non-member families, meaning leveraging my grandparents. So they're not members of the church, but they would leverage family members, and they would regularly talk to people in the church and say, okay, we need you. And they knew who had money. Like, they knew everything because it always was shared. So it was like, you need to go to so-and-so, this family member of yours, and ask for financial help for whatever it may be. Bank account currently held in Stephen and Trina Camp's names at the Founders Bank of Payson is used like a tithing account for Trina's purposes to donate money to whatever she sees fit. The money deposited in that account comes from William Camp, who currently handles the collective finances. In connection with the church permanent move to Tonto Village, Stephen Camp founded Tonto Village Investments, a business designed to hold property in Tonto Village in partnership, ideally, with all the members of the church. Currently, only he and his wife and 5 of their 8 children are partners. Stephen Camp acknowledged the church members purchased as many as 20 lots in Tonto Village. Now I'm going to pause on that. I remember sometime around that time there being a process where Stephen Camp was yelling at everybody who happened to be there that day, and I can't remember who all was there. I would say it's probably kids of my generation, and basically proceeded to tell everybody, hey, I want you to know that these houses, they're my legacy, and they are my inheritance to my family. And basically said to everybody else that they had not, should not be expecting any of that. And the hypocrisy of it, like this insane hypocrisy of it, because I was raised to never have an expectation that I should ever expect anything from my grandparents. And I think it was specifically that I was trained to not have an expectation of anything from my grandparents. So it was like, we're going to make sure that if your grandparents ever pass away, as much of that money as possible isn't going to make it into your hands. Or that you're going to be so brainwashed by us that you're just going to like shovel as much of it over as possible. So birthdays, anything that Christmas, like my grandparents used to send money for Christmas. They would send some money for my birthday. And every time they did, I had to tithe. And Stephen Camp would call or show up at your door to collect the checks. Like Christmas time, and it was like, did you get the money from your grandparents? Because he was coming to collect it. Not to mention all the times he leveraged making my parents go get money from specific things. So at the same time, they were talking about how the money was all handled. During the time me working at the law office, I talked a little bit about how they were floating money. And it's not something you can even do now, but they would float money, meaning that they would write checks and cover the checks before they bounced. And I don't know how many bank accounts they were working in, but they had two guys that were in the church who would run around depositing checks all day long to different banks. And I mean a myriad of banks and a myriad of checking accounts. So it was money going in and money going out over here and over here and over here and over here. And it was just like, it was like a shell game. And the only reason that stopped was because one of the bank bags, one of the guys who was running deposits one day goes running into a bank. He puts his bank bag underneath the seat, which had checks, cash, whatever it had in it. And he sticks it underneath the seat. And when he comes out, it was gone. And I am convinced that with everything going on, that the banks had realized that somebody was doing illegal activities and that they got somebody to follow them and to steal that from them. I don't think it was just happen chance. Somebody just happened to rob him. So that spurred a huge lawsuit that also went around at the same time. And that lawsuit was between the banks, and they were suing the people that they knew were involved for kiting. And that's what kiting is. It's like a money shell game. The money's not there, but you're moving it in a way that you can't really realize that there's actually no money there. And they were floating over $100,000. I believe it was over $100,000, which was a fucking lot of money in the early 90s. So they get caught, so that has to end. When that ends, it's a fucking shit show. And it's a shit show because they don't have enough money to cover everything. And all these and I believe there was bank accounts that were shut down at the time. So now they don't have the money to cover this, and they are flailing to figure it out. And that was one of the times that my dad went running to his parents to try to ask for more money. And I don't know how much he asked him for. I think it was a significant amount. Trina had a massive diamond ring. Trina had a 3-carat diamond ring. And so they one of the ways they were hoping to get the money was to, and I don't know if this was actually ever asked or if it was just suggested, but to see if my grandmother would hold the ring in lieu for getting paid back. There were times my grandparents said no, and luckily that was one of them. Then, from that, at some point, Trina went to go get her ring appraised. And I don't know if it was because she was trying to borrow money off of it, what exactly the deal was around the ring. I don't know what she paid for it when she got it. But she goes to get it appraised, and it doesn't appraise for near what she expects it to. So then they start another lawsuit against the jeweler that they bought the diamond ring from. So, and his name was Farrell Beezer. And so he was a local jeweler. And so they sued the pants off of him. And I was working for the law office during that because these were like these dominoes falling. They just were fucking suing everybody. Let's continue. 2 of the 4 Tono Village investment bank accounts are currently used to pay expenses for the church. Stephen and Trina can't have checking signing authority over at least one of these accounts. Former church member David Morin described being exhorted to choose between his wife, who resisted financially merging with the collective and the church, and being manipulated into disclosing his financial holdings, including his retirement funds. I don't remember David Morin. I just don't remember him. He may have been there when I was there, but I don't remember him. Morin's affidavit accounted that he paid nearly $70,000 to the members of the Camp family, though he lived with the collective for only 4 months, and that he had to borrow money to travel back home when he and his wife decided to leave. I 100% believe that is completely accurate. Former church member Sarah Light was pressured to sell her belongings in a garage sale and to sign her car over to the collective. As a result, Light had to borrow money in order to leave the church with her son. Mark Butterfield claimed to, and I don't remember who Sarah Light is either. Mark Butterfield claimed to have owned profitable rental property before joining the church, which he sold to contribute to the collective. Mark Butterfield also claimed to have loaned Stephen and Trina Camp the down payment for their house on 7th Street in Mesa. Stephen Camp claimed that the money he and Trina Camp used to buy the house was a gift from the Butterfields. I'm sure he did give it to him. Whether or not there was an expectation or a clear idea of whether he was ever getting it back, I don't know. Steve and Trina never were very big on acting like they were giving something back. But, I mean, they could have totally just fucking gaslit him some way. I don't disbelieve that either way. Trina and Stephen Camp still own the house in Mesa as well as a lot in Tonto Village that the Butterfields helped them buy. Mark Butterfield claimed to have been unable to make payments on a house in Mesa that he tried to buy while a member of the church. Probably. Mark Butterfield described the church as a cult, which he defined as a group that exists for the benefit of its leaders and at the expense of its followers. Stephen Wrench testified that what outsiders find hardest to accept about the church is the belief that in some instances a child must leave its biological family to join a spiritual family. Yeah. Trina and Stephen Camp have 4 children who are not their biological children. I mean, that was a rotating number. William and Jonah came to the church with their biological mother, but opted to remain as children of the Camps when she left with their 3 biological sisters. Yeah, they were there for, William was there for the longest time ever, him and his wife and their kids. Jonah had 2 marriages there, and a shit ton of children. And then he left in the middle of the night and was just went missing, left all of his kids behind. And I kind of understand it. Everybody's so traumatized. I think you get out how you get out. But unfortunately, there's so many people who just like left others behind and left their kids behind. And that's unfortunate. Stephen Wrench and his wife Marlo Camp have an adopted son, Zebariah, who is not the biological son of either parent. This child was subject to one of the documents Rick Ross reviewed before appearing on the broadcast, a letter in which Wrench warned Zeb's biological father to stay away from his son. So, Zeb, whose original name was Jordan, came with his mother, and then he kind of had to re-choose parents and chose Marlo and Steve. He was quite a character, but apparently there was threats coming from his father. And looking back, I would say that it's very possible those were because we were in a cult. But at the time, Zeb was married and had at least 1 child. And I believe the threats were in regards to her. Now, during trances, Duran always said he was going to handle it. And then that all kind of resolved itself because he ended up, and I believe he was in New York, and I believe he ended up getting shot and killed. And the gaslighting situation of it was that Duran had a part in that. So, as a spirit, like, that was how he created safety, was he had him killed. I can't make this shit up, you guys. I can't make this shit up. Stephen Camp participated in discouraging contact between some children adopted into church families and their biological families. 100%. Most people only kept relationships if there was financial strings attached to them. And a lot of people cut people off because it was the safest way to go about continuing things. Sarah Light testified that Stephen Camp once said to her son Ian while she was present, "You and I both know your mom is nuts, big time." Now, I think I do remember her son. I think he was younger than me. David Morin, Mark Butterfield, and Sarah Light joined the church after attending one of the camp's seminars. David Morin wrote that he and his wife paid the camp's $12,000 fee for a 6-month program before coming to live with them in Mesa, understanding this would pay for spiritual instruction as well as room and board. My parents paid a significant amount too, and I want to say it was like double that. Soon after joining, Morin was presumed to pay sums in addition to the 6-month program. By the time Morin left the church, he had paid nearly $70,000 to the camps. A lot of money back then. Mark Butterfield testified that the camps implied that if the Butterfields came to live with them in Mesa, the camps would teach them how to become seminar leaders themselves. The Butterfields never became seminar leaders as Stephen and Trina had. Mark Butterfield heard that Trina Camp acknowledged on several occasions that she chose the name Dr. Duran for the spirit that she trances, although according to the church teaching, he had a corporeal existence in the 14th century. When I was growing up, she stated that she had tranced for Duran Duran, the musical group, and that they had gotten the name Duran Duran from Duran, Dr. Duran, and later lied about it. They asked if they could use his name. I don't know if it's true. Sarah Light testified that Stephen and Trina Camp were remote and inaccessible once they arrived. Sarah Light rarely had access to Dr. Duran. Sarah Light testified that she was subordinate to other members when she lived in the church. Because members live collectively, share living facilities in close proximity, frequently employed in business founded and operated by others in the church, Rick Ross concluded that their time is likely to be dominated by church-related activities. That's another very common church thing, and a lot of churches do that. Even churches that you may not consider cults, they use the people as a resource in a way that is above and beyond asking a lot of the time. I'm not saying you shouldn't give to your church. Sarah Light complained that she could not choose her own food or sleep on her own schedule, that she could not retain any of her wages for personal expenditures, and that she was not permitted to use her own car to take her son sightseeing. I believe that 100%. Food was often, she wasn't there during the time that food was delivered to the door, but, food was definitely, you weren't going to the grocery store to pick out your own food. And there was definitely an expectation on, not a sleeping schedule per se, but you definitely had to go along with the flow of whatever it was. Sarah Light testified that the church controlled her thoughts through its structured living arrangements. I know that I was in the environment of a lot of control and manipulation, that I was only supposed to think certain ways, that because my food and sleep and schedule were being controlled, that I was not able to have my own individuality. Paulette Butterfield acknowledged that as a church teacher, she was responsible for conducting processes in which she and other members of the group would confront individuals over their personal failings. Processes is a means of breaking down personal barriers to intimacy. Stephen Camp attended processes that lasted as long as 14 hours. This is where they were just fucking abusive. They were just a sit and wear you down and break you down. Paulette Butterfield described processes as a form of mental torture. In his affidavit, Morin recounted an incident in which Stephen Camp had encouraged Morin to open up to him about his past relationship with women, confronted Morin's new wife with Morin's confession that he had sometimes resented women for using him financially, and challenged her to give her money to the church if she loved her husband, because that is what Morin wanted. Shortly after this incident, the Morins paid the camps over $50,000. Speechless. Sarah Light testified that Stephen Camp once pressured her to confess whether she believed the church was a cult by telling her the story of a woman who appeared to be a happy member of the church, but who left the collective through deceit to return to her parents and enter a cult deprogramming program. Light answered the church was a family, not a cult. You guys, we all fucking said that so many times. In November 5th of 93, the church and the Camp's immediate family sued Dave and Connie Miller of Tonto Village over allegations the Millers spread false rumors that the church members engaged in cult-like practices such as devil worship, satanic rituals, including the sacrifice of animals, nude dancing, rituals involving children, drinking blood, and selling children. Now, those were all rumors. We never did any of that kind of stuff. There was none of that. The church, February 25th, 94 memorandum supported motion, asserted that the rumors allegedly spread by the Millers had affected virtually everyone in the Payson area. The cult in Tonto Village becomes so widespread that there's no one left without knowledge of an opinion. So this is where they were trying to get it moved to a different venue. The church issued deposition subpoenas of 13 of their Tonto Village neighbors as third-party witnesses, which led to the Miller's lawyer to protest the church's abuse of discovery. Yeah, that sounds like something they would do. Go and subpoena everybody to get their opinions on whether people are spreading rumors and abuse them. Similarly, the group called themselves Concerned Residents of Tonto Village. Tonto Village also wrote church attorneys protesting the way they were handling the Miller lawsuit. A copy of this letter was forwarded to Carolyn Dreyer, editor of the Mongolian Advisor, with a request that it be published. A letter from Concerned Residents of Tonto Village to Wrench and Walker. I don't know if that... I mean, there was a lot of things that were in the Payson Roundup, so... The church members filed an application for charter status for the Shelby School in December of 1994. The application was preliminarily approved on March 27th, but upon further review was denied May 22nd. The church wished to open the Shelby School to Arizona children outside the church. The church voluntarily dismissed its lawsuit against the Millers before trial in July of 95 after a presiding judge permitted Trina Camp to trance in the courtroom. Reporter Tony Kovaleski observed that the church had retained armed guards in reaction to alleged assaults from their residents of Tonto Village. Stephen Wrench testified that these guards were hired in the first days of August of 1995. I wasn't really sure on the date, but that tracks. Must have just perpetuated. I didn't realize it was 95. I thought it was closer to earlier than that. Stephen Camp arranged for Trina Camp to trans Dr. Duran on Payson radio talk show broadcast in August of 1995. Didn't know she was on that. Stephen Camp agreed for him and his wife to be interviewed by a journalist whose article concerning the Miller lawsuit appeared on the front page of the Arizona Republic, which I shared that with you. Trina Camp does not believe Ross made his comments about the church with actual malice. So, and here's some things that the reason that it was called a church, or a cult, I'm sorry. Pyramid structure of authority wherein leaders are unaccountable to group members. Fostering an us versus them mentality. That's a very common church thing, you guys. If your church is like, there's no reason for it. What in God says you should be us versus them? Psychological, emotional, physical, or financial exploitation, undermining relationships among biological family members, deceptive techniques of recruitment, isolation from the world dominating individual members' time, undue influence, brainwashing, or mind control. That's pretty much it. The church buying a bunch of lots, different members, the armed guards, different members, statements of losing money. Yeah. So, oh, I wasn't done. I'm sorry. New Times. Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlatans. This was by Tony Ortega, November 30th of 1995. This is specifically an article on Rick Ross. Rick Ross is describing how cults use mind control to exploit members. He warns about 70 people gathered at Arizona State University Memorial Union that they're prime targets for groups that tend to prey on university students. The Moonies have a house on North Central Scientology. So, like, he's going through ones in Arizona that you should be careful and talking to a group of ASU students. And the ASU students are prime targets for groups that tend to prey on university students. So the Moonies have a house on North Central. Scientology is a church in Mesa. Scottsdale's CBJ, whose members believe they will live forever. I've had meetings with people out of that one. Close family members of people out of that one. And at ASU's itself, there's a chapter of ICC, which Ross says has been booted out of 12 colleges, including the University of Arizona, for its aggressive recruitment techniques. The list grows as Ross turns over his carefully prepared note cards. Rick Ross looks more like an advertising executive than one of nation's foremost exit counselors, as deprogrammers prefer to be called, with more than 250 deprogrammings on his resume. A well-groomed 43-year-old is giving the 5th lecture in a month that's taken him to universities in Oregon, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Alabama. Now the Phoenix resident is back home speaking at ASU for the first time in 10 years. Since his last lecture at ASU, his notoriety as an expert on Bible-based cults, New Age groups, and the militia movement has made him a national figure and regular on the talk show circuit. He has also made many enemies, and even now he's in their midst. Unbeknownst to Ross, the student in the front row tapping his lecture, the one on the bandana on his head, is actually a private investigator. Ross doesn't realize that a process server is sitting near the door. Nor is he aware that a pile of documents containing intimate details of his life are stacked in bundles on a table. He has no clue that Stephen Camp, the man responsible for the ambush of sorts, is sitting patiently in the back of the room. When Ross ends his presentation, Camp stands to speak. He's a large man with copious amounts of graying hair and bushy mustache. "Remember me?" Camp asks. "No," Ross answers. "You brought my church up in your lecture tonight. You called my church a cult." It isn't the first time Ross has made that allegation. 2 months earlier, on a television news broadcast, Rick Ross had labeled Camp's Tano Village commune, the Church of Immortal Consciousness, a destructive cult. Enraged, Camp has followed Ross to ASU looking for satisfaction, and he's brought along his son, his attorney, the undercover investigator, the process server, the incriminating dossier. Camp says he doesn't like to be lumped in with skinheads and Branch Davidians. Ross responds by citing cultish activities Camp's neighbors have accused him of. "Look, maybe we can resolve things in a human-to-human moment," Camp says, offering to come up to the podium to work out the conflict. Like, how fucking... Like, the guy's speaking and you're just, like, gonna ambush him. It's not clear whether Camp means to hug Ross or deck him, but the deprogrammer wants no part of it. Ross tells him to sit down, and the confrontation becomes a shouting match. The audience cringes in embarrassment. Although Ross is used to being heckled and harassed, he's grateful when a sympathetic professor wrestles control of the floor with a question of his own. Camp sees that he's getting nowhere, and he stalks out with his son and his lawyer. As the gathering breaks up, the process server hands Ross a copy of a $1.5 million lawsuit filed against him that day, November 14th, by Camp. If Stephen Camp is looking for a quick payday, he may be too late. Ross has filed bankruptcy after getting hit with a $3.1 million judgment in a civil suit brought by a Washington man who says Ross deprogramming deprived him of his civil rights. Ross has been reviled in print as a kidnapper and a vicious religion hater. Some even blame him for the disaster at Waco, Texas. He's been hounded by private investigators and threatened with violence. Some of his friends fear for his life. But the day after his confrontation with Stephen Camp, Ross is back to work, fighting mind control. He begins deprogramming a California woman whose husband wants her to leave a strict Pentecostal sect, a cult. Ross insists that's convinced she'll rot in hell if she leaves the fold. For 3 days, Ross will meet with her in a hotel room near Sky Harbor Airport, hoping to convince her that God is not the man in Redding to whom she's been sending so many checks. Ross is known for his facility with the Bible, his talent for untwisting the scripture that cult leaders employ to justify exploitative or even criminal behavior has put him in great demand, and after 13 years in some of the most notable cases in American cult history, when Rick Ross calls a group a cult, people listen. Therein lies the rub. What goes into making the call, pronouncing whether a group is destructive or merely eccentric, is the subject of wide disagreement among deprogrammers like Ross. Academics, church leaders, and believers, one man's salvation is another man's enslavement. Stephen Camp says that in the case of his church, Ross hasn't done his homework, and he relied on secondhand information and unfounded allegations by intolerant neighbors. Ross insists he's thorough when he investigates a group and decides to call it a cult. By Ross's definition, cults share common traits regardless of their theology. They have a leader with too much influence and too little accountability. They frequently demand forfeiture of property. They encourage recruits to isolate themselves from family and friends, overwhelming them and robbing them of critical thinking skills. In deprogramming, the counselor chips away the wall, separating the cult member from independent thought, and the best way to do this, Ross says, is to ask questions. Sometimes that isn't easy. For Kathy Tonkin, a Ross client whose sons were in a cult, asking questions had become next to impossible. Sometimes she turned to Rick Ross in the 90s to do an involuntary deprogramming. Some people call it kidnapping to force her sons to hear her concerns. And this is a very long article, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just seeing if there's anything else relevant. So this goes through different deprogrammings, people who've given other money, and just all in all, different people that he's gone through stuff with. And accusations that he's had. Different cults he mentions. So here's some notable things. In 1985, Ross deprogrammed Joyce Vlukovic, who accused and later acquitted in the famous Redmond murder case while awaiting her 3 trials, fallen into radical Pentecostal jail ministry and given up Judaism. Ross was hired by the daughter and persuaded to leave the sect. California cult believes that children are a stumbling block to salvation and asks married adults to undergo sterilization. Ross talked a 25-year-old woman into leaving the group before she tied her tubes for the Lord. January of 91, Ross was hired by Wisconsin family to deprogram a son who had become a robotic member of the Missionaries to the Preborn, a radical anti-abortion group. He was being trained to carry out violence against doctors, and his journal contained plans for bombing clinics. Today, after Ross counseling, the young man is in graduate school, still very much pro-life, Ross says, but no longer to join a group bent on violence. During the 1993 Branch Davidian siege near Waco, Texas, Ross acted as a consultant to the FBI. In the 13 years since someone told his grandmother she was going to burn in hell, Ross has counseled 250 to 300 cult members and estimates that 80% left their exploitive gurus. gets into some stuff about Scientology. Yeah, so sorry for the pauses. I'm just seeing if there's anything else. Goes into the Waco Branch Davidian incident, and oh wait, here we go. When a local Christian church found out that Ross would be an expert in a trial involving one of its members, it submitted documents about Ross's criminal history that had come from a Scientology publication. Stephen Camp of the Church of Immortal Consciousness admits that the dossier of Ross documents that he gives to the press was put together by Kendrick Moxon, the Scientologist attorney representing Jason Scott. Oh my gosh, you guys, I didn't know that. So we're getting stuff from Scientology to go after Rick Ross. That's fucking great. Camp says Ross knew too little about the Church of Immortal Consciousness when he called it a destructive cult. Ross defends his characterization. It is a new group and the file on them isn't an inch thick yet, but the evidence that's coming in is very solid and indicates that this is a destructive cult group, he says. To reach his assessment, Ross watched videotapes of Stephen Camp's wife Trina as she issued church teachings by trancing the spirit of a dead Englishman named Dr. Duran. He viewed tapes of Channel 15's interview with an ex-church member who claims to have lost more than $70,000 to the camps. Ross also pored over depositions filed in many lawsuits the church has filed. Channel 15's Tony Kowaleski spent a week filming at the Tana Village commune, says that he was impressed by the work that Ross did to prepare for his interview. He didn't want to come in and give us an opinion without preparing thoroughly. Rick was as prepared as anyone I've ever dealt with. The camps say Kowaleski burned them after they gave him unrestricted access to their organization. He raped us, I feel, Trina Camp says. She would say something like that. Stephen Wrench, a church member and one of the camp's attorneys, says the church intends to expand its defamation suit to include Channel 15. Trina Camp's been a minor celebrity ever since she went into trance in the Gila County courtroom last July, so Dr. Duran, who supposedly lived in the 14th century, could testify. Until then, relatively few people knew what kind of theology was practiced at the church. Trina and Stephen Camp say it's Duran, not the camps, who runs the church. The camp began moving their commune to Tana Village about 8 years ago. Now it owns 15 of the village's 250 lots and plans to purchase more. That's caused friction. What really made the neighbors howl was the camp's plan to get the state charter for the church-operated Shelby School in its application to the state. The camps claimed that the school was non-sectarian, citing credit problems, and the state ultimately denied the charter, which have qualified the school for $180,000 in state funds. The camps are suing the state. Stephen Camp thinks most of the animosity in the village comes from intolerance. Gila County's born-again Christian and militia country, he says. If the Church of Immortal Consciousness had set up shop in California, he said nobody would care. I think a lot of the people who complain have boring lives and we give them something to talk about, Camp says. No shit. In 1993, the Church of Immortal Consciousness sued Connie and Dave Miller, claiming that the Tana Village couple had spread rumors that the church was involved in devil worshiping, satanic rituals, including the sacrifice of animals, nude dancing, rituals involving children, the drinking of blood, and the selling of children. Actually, several villagers claimed the camps used the suit as an excuse to subpoena everyone in town. If rumors were flying in the village, they had less to do with devil worship than with complaints about harassment and intimidation. There was a peaceful country quiet here, but now there's a stomach-tightening anxiousness, says Rita Spalink, one of the camp's most outspoken critics in the village. The problem up here is not with religion. The problem is with overbearing harassment and attitude. Linda Staley agrees. They're affecting a nice neighborhood in a bad way. When they sued Dave and Connie Miller, it really rubbed people the wrong way. We don't have lawyers like they do. The nervousness has spread to nearby Payson. Residents fear something bad could happen in Tana Village. That talk escalated when it learned the camps had hired armed private investigators to provide security. For some, the events in Tana Village evoke memories of Miracle Valley in the early 1980s Reverend Frances Thomas and her Christ Miracle Healing Center moved from Chicago into an established village near the Mexican border in Cochise County. The church operated its own school. Church members intimidated and harassed residents, buying up the homes of those who left. Tensions mounted when armed church members began to patrol the streets. On October of '83, heavily armed lawmen invaded Miracle Valley to serve traffic warrants, and all hell broke loose. 2 church members were shot and killed. 1 deputy died months later from injuries sustained. If trouble erupts in Tonto Village, say the camps, it won't be their fault. They say they're peaceful people who hired armed guards only because the children of the church members have been assaulted. They've heard the talk that their commune is a little Waco, and they don't appreciate it. The last thing they need is for Rick Ross to call them a cult. We don't necessarily disagree with him on the groups he names. He just made a mistake about us, says Stephen Camp. Ross is certain he didn't. Pointing to the camp's litigiousness, Ross says the Church of Immortal Consciousness is starting to look like a little church of Scientology. When Ross goes to bankruptcy court this week, he expects representatives for Scientology in the camps to fight his attempts to discharge his debts. Scientology thinks they can crush me and shut me down with harassment lawsuits. As long as his expertise is needed, he will provide it. The reality is that what would do me in is if the people stopped ringing. If the phone stopped ringing, and it's not, because there are people out there who need help. I don't make it so, it's the cults that do, and that's what causes me to work. Whew. So, I have summed up the lawsuits. We're going to call it for today. Hope you guys enjoyed that episode. It was a lot. See you guys soon. Bye-bye.